Okay, as we resume this exploration of reality through the lens of geometry, I thought I'd reflect on why this matters to me personally. And to begin with, as context, I would say that 70% of the pain that I've experienced in my life has been psychological, physiological, in the dimension of untreated, unrepaired trauma. It's sometimes called complex PTSD, PTSD, but it's a phenomena by which early childhood memories are locked into the biology in such a way that repeat, that enter a timeless space and repeat over and over again as biological memories that are not subject to the objective outer reality, meaning the traumatic events are not repeating over and over again for the most part in adult life. But the body is feeling them, often through the lens of a regressed child. Now, the greatest lens into this phenomena is traumatic literature. Bessel van der Kolk and several others have speared that on the scientific side. But part of the question that any sane person asks themselves is, if 70% of pain, of dis-ease, is occurring in this field of traumatic literature, traumatic science, then an intelligent person, an intelligent culture, and I'm using myself as an example, but the more I've studied the traumatic literature, the more I understand that this is, of course, by no means personal. That the fact that my parents had trauma and embodied various aspects of PTSD into their own identities and habits, the intergenerational abuse patterns that happen predictably to any trained psychologist in this area, are very widespread. 1 in 7 Americans is a substance addict. All substance addiction, in the more detailed and nuanced research that has been pioneered by such professors as Gabor Mate, point to pain management as the primary source of the addiction, meaning that they used to do lab studies in rats where they would take the rats and put them under Klieg lights and surround them by sociopathic scientists, people intent on killing them, out of their natural environment. In essence, they would traumatize the shit out of these rats, and then they would give them the choice to take a pain-numbing substance, such as cocaine, and obliviate the sociopathic environment induced by the sociopathic scientists around them, or they could sit there in terror wondering how these mad scientists were going to treat them next. And in these conditions, the rats did indeed show addictive tendencies. However, when you take the same rats and put them in nature with good, healthy food and a secure attachment, meaning a healthy, natural family of rats, in a safe, natural environment, with normal, healthy foods, seeds, all the things that rats eat in the wild, that these rats did not addict to cocaine and other substances, suggesting that in order for a mammal to become and prefer an addiction, they had to be in a certain amount of chronic environmental pain, or had to be traumatized to such an extent that their body chemicals were giving them these messages. Now, I look at my own education in this culture, and the root word of culture is cult. I look at my own education in this cult, and I ask myself, if no amount of money cures my traumatic symptoms, if the 40 therapists that I've worked with largely either make the traumatic symptoms worse or in most cases do not address them directly at all, because most therapists are traumatically illiterate, how is it that 70% of my pain, of my disease, in the course of a lifetime is associated with something that I can go from cradle to grave in this cult without learning anything about? How is it that trigonometry, geometry, algebra, history of presidents, that any number of arcane and largely useless subjects for daily life can be gone on about as if the world depended upon it, while ignoring the pink elephant in the room? The pink elephant in the room being that a noticeable demographic in any classroom is dealing with some degree of trauma. Most of the symptoms in the DSM manual, depression, hyperactivity, attention deficit disorder, are natural reflexes when a body is sending traumatic symptoms, bidding for attention, saying, look at me, it's a big deal that your mother's being beaten. Look at me, it's a big deal that you were hit by a giant. Look at me, it's a big deal that you were humiliated and that no one stood up for you. That these things actually matter to a child and to an individual's life far more than whether or not you ace calculus. That you can ace calculus and still suffer the statistical consequences of trauma for your entire life, and never use calculus one day in your life after you've finished education that's supposed to prepare you for life. Now, what one starts to see, what I see as I look at the divide here, at what topics are covered and what topics are not, is that everything to do with feminine terrain, relationships, community, team building, emotional literacy, conflict resolution, trauma repair, PTSD and PTSD repair, that everything in the domain of the feminine, emotions, relationships, and ecological awareness, is completely and utterly ignored, even while it dominates the influence on the average human being for the entirety of their life. So if you were to say we're a scientific cult and we're preparing you for life, you would make a list of all the things that affect your life, and you would prioritize what affects your life the most. For example, everyone eats food every day. Okay, so deciding what food to put into your body, how your body functions, and how to prepare that food, and how to grow that food sustainably in the environment would be pretty high up there. We're all doing that 3 times a day. We're not all taking algebra quizzes 3 times a day. Having a successful, satisfying, rich, low abuse romantic relationship, well, almost everyone wants that. That would be high on the list and affect your well-being every day. In fact, the very few scientists that study happiness and well-being, such as Sonia Lyubomirsky, and she's the outlier in a cult that won't study these things, discovers that personal relationships have a far higher impact on personal well-being than being very wealthy. So it's not very scientific to set people up to aspire to be very wealthy and teach them nothing about relationships. So there's a divergence between science and cult. And then you say, well, why is that? And there have been 10,000 cults in human history, each with their own language, their own mythology, their own rank system. And of course, we are a materialistic cult, and so we rank people in large part based on what they have, how much money they have, how many cars they have, what kind of cars, what brands they're wearing, you name it. What their house looks like, what neighborhood they are in, is their skin this color or this color. Even that ties back a little bit to money when, for example, in the United States, African Americans are statistically, due to the level of racism, lower income than white people, so it's good to be white. I'm sure in a materialistic cult where 95% of all the African Americans were very rich, and 95% of all the Caucasians were very poor, it would be ranked higher in a materialistic cult to be black. So in this context, cults are all self-referential. You can visit any cult in human history, anywhere on the globe, and you ask them why they are doing things the way they are doing things. And the difference between science and a self-referential loop or a dogma, the difference between science and a cult, is that in science you have data-based reasons for doing what you're doing. So for example, if this was a scientific cult, we would say, well, we've done studies, and this group of people, we taught them how to communicate clearly. We taught them how to have great teamships. We taught them how to diffuse violent situations. We taught them how to defend themselves against rape and how to report rape. We taught them how to be good parents that didn't traumatize their children. We taught them how to eat delicious food, how to exercise well and do yoga. That's what we taught this group. And this other group, we taught them algebra, trigonometry, the name of presidents, when X bridges were built, when wars were fought, and how many people died, and on what date the war ended. That's what we taught this group, and that's what we taught this group. And then, since every cult has the same ambition, since every human being on the history of the planet has the same ambition, which is to feel sustainably better and to avoid feeling chronically worse, we then measured how good these people felt practicing these skills and how well these people felt living a life based on these skills. And then we built the education curriculum based on what made people sustainably happier over time. And what we discovered was that even though this group of people never used algebra a day in their life, never used trigonometry in the day in their life, and that the names of this bridge and this general and that general went in one ear and out the other, they were so much happier than these people who knew how to have effective marriages that we based the education curriculum on algebra, trigonometry, calculus, bridge construction dates, wars, and presidents. And so that's how we arrived at our cult of education. That's a scientific response. But of course, those studies haven't been done. And the idea that if they were done, someone who studied algebra would be happier than someone who studied effective parenting, trauma resolution, and relationship and community building, someone who studied sustainable, healthy diets and exercise, that these people would all be more miserable than the people who studied the dates of wars, is a laughable hypothesis. And we're living in the cult where the majority of people have been forcibly indoctrinated with these skill sets, and where you can go the entirety of your life without a single hour of competent emotional literacy. Now, this can happen in a cult for the simple reason that cults are not scientific. They're self-referential. It's very simple in any cult. You go to any cult in human history and you say, is this the way to do things? They say, yes, it's the way we do things around here. You say, well, why do you do them? Well, that's the way we did them before. That's what they taught us at school. And why did they do? Well, that's what they taught them at school. There's no reference to well-being. There's no reference to data. There's simply a reference to itself. We do it because we do it because we do it. And the question is, when you've been indoctrinated into a cult, how do you break out of the indoctrination? Because when you're blind to something that everyone around you is blind to, there's no basis to know that you're blind to it. If you don't see the color blue, and nor does anyone else, and your cult dogma is that blue doesn't exist, if you get some sense that this could be some strange thing that nobody's talking about, and they all dismiss it, you stay ignorant. Now, that's, in other words, when you look at reality through the lens of your cult, you look at it through the blind spots of your cult. So if you want to break out of that level of indoctrination, you have to switch to some form of science that is data-based. And this, I think, is one of the most useful aspects of geometry. Because if you looked at a circle and you said, we're going to have cars that have wheels, where half of the wheel is cut off and ignored and thrown away as useless, and the other half of the wheel is built up as this pinnacle of cult ranking, as this is the pinnacle of our cult. You try and drive those wheels. And then you try and drive another car that actually has full round wheels. You have to be pretty moronic to stick to your dogma and drive the half-wheeled car over the fully wheeled car. And so what geometry can provide a lens to is the regions of reality that are as valid as any other region in geometry, but are being ignored in the cult. For example, you cannot prove scientifically that this point of the triangle is more important to the structural integrity of the circle than this. In an equilateral triangle, built of all the same materials, you can test that 1,000 times, and your dogma, your bias, won't hold up to the testing. And so if you want to be true to science, you update, you abort your dogma, and you update the design. Now, in order to abort cult dogma, it's useful to understand how things look through the dimension, through the lens of geometry. And that's my interest in geometry, that geometry helps me understand that I'm living in a cult that's cut half of the psyche in half and discarded it, the feminine, and elevated the other, and is riding along in a great deal of dis-ease that we're all aware of. There is a tremendous amount of chronic, unnecessary suffering and violation produced generation after generation in our cult. And having a lot of money, or a lot of houses, or a lot of cars, etc., doesn't get to the core of the disease. If anything, it's a diversion. So, what can we see about geometry? And when we understand that every cult is a system, it is a system, and that it starts with the circular possibility field, meaning when you have no cult whatsoever, you can design any cult. You can decide to worship black or white. It doesn't really matter when you're starting from scratch. You can worship heaven, or you can worship the earth. You can say that fire is more important than water, or water is more important than fire. Or you can say they're all equal. You can invent whatever kind of cult you want. When you've got a completely neutral palette in education, you can just study the life of ants. It'll probably do you as much good as studying algebra, given that most of us have never used algebra a day in our life, other than to pass tests. Most of us would probably not use ant technology a day in our life either, but we might actually understand relationships and ecology a little bit more, whereas algebra takes us into the abstract, an abstraction that doesn't necessarily connect with a finite ecological planet that our cult is destroying at a more rapid rate per capita than any cult in human history. So if we were looking at an ecological lens, through an ecological lens, alarm bells would be going off as the primary priority. We would say we're going backwards, because the Native Americans on this same land destroyed less of their ecology per capita, per individual, than we did, by a factor of 1,000. So we've gone 1,000 times in the wrong direction if we look through the lens of ecology. If we look through the lens of materialism, however, we have made 1,000 times progress. The Native Americans just had a teepee that biodegraded, and they had no garbage, no waste, everything was sacred, and they consumed very little. They didn't have Netflix binges, they didn't pollute, they didn't consume 90,000 gallons of gasoline per person, they didn't create 100 tons of garbage. They hadn't even begun the rat race. And now look at us, we won. If we could just bring the 100 tons of garbage per person up to 300 tons of garbage, it would have meant we've consumed even more, and we're making progress. Through the lens of materialism, through the lens of ecology, we're going in the wrong direction. And so you get this sense that there are these dualities, that what is progress from one perspective is going backwards from another. Well, you can see that in geometry. You can see in geometry, from the center of the circle, from a centered place, that if you head off here, you're getting closer to this realm of possibility, and you're getting simultaneously further away from this part. You see certain things through geometry that you don't see through a cult referential lens. Now, there's a couple of things that I find interesting that I see in geometry. The first being that the sphere is this amazing shape that is both infinite and one, and at the same time. Because when you compose a sphere in computers, you either refract a very large number of lines, and what emerges in the circle is a sphere. So let's say you make 1,000 lines. And then in the center is this circular shape. And so you have the 1,000 lines, that's the particle, the masculine expression, and you have the one, you have the sphere, the space that emerges in the middle. Same with dots. If you make a circle on a computer or a TV screen, let's say it's a 4K screen, so you have millions of little dots add up to create the oneness. So is it one or is it a million? It depends on the lens of refraction. If you look through the particle lens, it's a million dots. If you look through the one lens, the feminine lens, it's one. It's one or it's a million. And you can make a sphere with a trillion dots, refracted, a trillion lines to make the sphere. It's infinite and it's one. So that's a very interesting property of the circle. In that way, you can also see the interconnectedness of masculinity, and what you would reveal is that it is unintelligent to obsess about masculinity in men and in women, and to ignore the femininity in men and in women. So you'd say the cult is out of sync with the underlying physics, with the underlying geometry. And whenever you get out of sync with reality, your dis-ease goes up. Your dis-ease, your pain, goes up in proportion to which you are out of attunement with reality. You can see that in so many levels. If I pretend that this wall doesn't exist, I'm harboring a delusion. Now, when I move and hit this, I have a choice. I can update my delusion and say, okay, I was wrong. This does exist. Or I can keep bashing away at it, and maybe eventually this will get knocked down, and I can say, see, it doesn't exist. But I've got a dinged up car that bears evidence that it used to before I ran into a concrete wall, or I've got a totaled car. I have to go get another one to bang into the wall. Pain escalates when we relate to reality out of sync with reality and in sync with our dogmas. Every cult has a dogmatic aspect that is out of sync with the underlying reality, which is why every cult, at some level, leads to suffering. How much suffering depends on how far it diverges from reality and how much the people in the cult cling to the dogma of the cult and to hell with reality. So that's one of the things you can see with the circle. Now, one of the things that's interesting is you also have things like integrity and strength and grace. These are mathematical formulas. And you can see that if you did this little triangle here, if you had a hula hoop, and you reinforced the hula hoop in this design with a few pieces of bamboo and tape, you would see that this area of the hula hoop could collapse easily. And this area wouldn't collapse easily because it's reinforced with bamboo. So if you wanted to design a hula hoop for maximum resilience and you only had three distinctions, 3 pieces of bamboo, you would do an equilateral triangle. And that would give you the strongest hula hoop with the least amount of energy. Now, of course, if you made it into a six-sided reinforcement, it would be stronger, but you use twice the energy. So within a given amount of energy, distributing it equally leads to the most resilient and thus the most sustainable shape, because we're looking at how sustainable is this system. It is more sustainable when it is an equilateral triangle. And we see that also when we see that, let's say, in the cult dogma, these people here, these people are important people and all of these people are not important people. Because that's what racism is. It's saying this group of people doesn't matter. We matter. It's always us. So if you design it this way and you say, oh, this doesn't matter, well, when you violate and abuse a circle, it breaks at its weakest link. When you have poor, malnourished, frightened, traumatized people making short-sighted decisions, cleanliness is one of the things that gets by the wayside. People eat dirty food. When a virus like the coronavirus enters the population, it often enters the population through the weakest bodies on the planet. Now, the weakest bodies are the most abused and malnourished, which usually in a capitalist framework means the poorest. So a virus enters the human system through the poorest people. The most malnourished and abused people on the planet become the first host to a virus, after which it can mutate and spread. Now, as it mutates and spreads, it spreads to the healthiest people on the planet, eventually. So a species and an ecology is only as strong as its weakest link. So when you dogmatically and artificially elevate some people way over in value than others and let them catch diseases, for example, you will pay far more money in the long run to eradicate the disease out of a global population than it would have taken to help the poorest people be more nourished. And geometry can reveal that. Because if your goal was to have a hula hoop that stayed together, and you reinforced it here and did no reinforcing over here, and then started throwing the thing against rocks and all the various things that, it encounters in reality, where it's going to break and collapse is in the area that's untended. And so geometry reveals what intelligence looks like, what an intelligent disbursement of care and nourishment looks like as a species, in a way that a cult says, oh, no, you don't understand. They're homeless people. They're not important. Why aren't they important? Because they don't have a house. Oh, I see. So the only people who are important have houses. Yes, we're a materialist cult. Don't you understand? And a house is a big piece of material, so you're really important if you have your own house, and you're not worth anything if you don't. Oh, I see. Well, that's what cult materialism reveals. But what does a virus tell us? Does a virus say, oh, I'm not going to infect this homeless person and spread into the country because they don't have a house? A virus is not as stupid as the snootiness of cult snobs. So you see that snobbery is unscientific. And geometry can reveal that, and it's useful. Now, what you get in a very simplistic system of reality is you realize that if it's going to be a simple system, in this case a system of 3, you want to spread the system out equally. It should be symmetrical in relationship to what? The archetypal sphere. So you take the possibility field. You take the possibility field and you try and divide it equally in all directions. You develop thinking on one side and you develop feeling on the other. Now, if you can't grasp that, if you really think that thinking is more important than feeling, well, first of all, you don't understand the correlation between the two. Because every single thought in the history of humankind is electrically generated by feelings, which express themselves in the electricity biology of the body, ecology of the body. It's all electrical signals. And what affects your thinking more than anything else is your feelings. So if you don't study the thing that gives birth to the thing that you do study, you're moronic at some level. You're asymmetrical. You're not looking at the ecological framework. It's like saying gold is valuable, but gold miners are not. Well, without gold miners, you don't get gold. So if gold is valuable, then gold miners who produce gold are even more valuable. If gold is valuable, then the earth that produces gold is more valuable than the gold. So to destroy the earth in order to get gold, which is more valuable than gold, is a faulty equation. So you can see things that are hidden behind the mask of the cult. This is the power of geometry. Now, one of the interesting things comes as you get into larger numbers of symmetrically distributed things. If you look at this from a structural point of view, these are points, the masculine expression, and we've gone from a 3-point system to a 5-point system. And you've equally distributed the system here as best you can. You've got symmetrical distribution of the 5-point system, but you see that if the strongest sphere, the strongest circle, the strongest structure has mutual connections with every other point within the structure. Now this system, the sphere, is infinite. It's not a 5-pointed star. It's a trillion pointed star. But the human brain can't grasp the complexity of dots that literally create the oneness of the sphere. And so let's say we're just evolving. We're evolving from a simple system of three distinctions to a slightly more complex system of 5 distinctions. Even so, even though all of this data is left out of the equation, because within this system, all that is conscious is within the system. If you are conscious of a 5-pointed star, you are not conscious of the infinite sphere in which it is held. You're conscious of these points. So what gets left out of the equation? Well, in the triangle, half of reality gets left out. This is conscious, this conscious, and the relationship between those are conscious, but all of this stuff is unconscious, which means you bang into it. It's that wall you're hitting. And in this thing, you've got more than 50% is conscious, because you can triangulate consciousness anywhere between these lines. And then you think, well, you've got a line here, a line here, a line here, and a line here. That's a start. But the circle, the system, gets significantly strengthened if you add crossbars here. If you're building a dome or whatever it is that you're constructing, or if you're doing a wheel, if you add these relationships here so that this point connects to here, 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 and here, diagonally and this way, it is the strongest that can be made within a 5-pointed system. Now you could add lines to the middle points and it would be even stronger, but then you would need to differentiate. You'd need to make some kind of a mark for the middle and call it something. You'd need to expand the consciousness into being a 10-point system, and then you could have more connections. So one of the things that geometry teaches us is that the more mutual connections that are evenly placed in the ecology that is being observed, participated in, and measured, the stronger the ecology. The other thing we can see is through specialization. And we're relatively specialized as cults, in part because, that's part of the masculine direction, to break the circle down into as many parts as possible and then focus just on that part as if it had nothing to do with all the other parts. So you have, hand and elbow specialists at the hospital, and they only do hand and elbow surgeries and know all about that, but they know nothing about the kidneys, and they know nothing about how their painkillers, while they're doing their elbow surgeries, affect the kidneys, because that's the kidney person's job. My job is just to fix the elbow and cause enough pain or reduce enough pain that my patients aren't mad at me, and if that destroys the kidney somewhere else, that's not my problem. I'm a hand and elbow specialist. And so part of what we learn through specialization is that if I was the only person on the planet, I would have to be a complete generalist. I'd have to give birth to myself. I can't do that. So I'd be dead. But assuming I could, then I'd have to raise myself on milk. I can't do that. But assuming, there's a lot of assumptions to pretend that an ego is really independent. But assuming we got to the point where I'm now my age, and then we artificially, and I say artificially because you cannot delete the past and you cannot delete ecological connections. But if we just pretend for the sake of cult dogma that I'm an independent person and that my parents are irrelevant and that my ecology is irrelevant and the language I'm using was all me, right? I invented the English language. And we say, okay, here I am, and I want to come up with a necklace. I can't do it. You see, one person in one lifetime can't discover the periodic tables, discover what silver is, learn how to mine silver, discover fire, learn how to smelt silver. One person is going to be busy out in the wild trying to stay alive and hunt with a stick because there isn't anything else that's been invented. One person in one lifetime would never invent a necklace made of gems that are 40 to 200 million years old. Amethyst, 40 to 200 million years old. Would you even know that it existed? See, in order to have the grace, the tremendous grace of owning a necklace like this, millions of people were involved in discovering metalsmithing, silver, the idea of jewelry, this, that, and the other. Millions more were involved in diamond bit development and polishing techniques and shipping containers. And all that had to happen so that I could press buy with one click. And amazingly, this emerges. So there is an abundance that comes with complexity and specialization. There's also a myopia that comes with specialization. So you have both abundance and myopia. Nothing is free in the universe. As you move towards this point, you move away from this point. The circle says that all things are equal. The cult says that the more you have, the better you are. The more money you have, the taller you are, the more handsome you are. Whatever it is, the cult creates one-directional lines and then ranks each person relative to one another on those directions of lines. Well, I graduated high school on the line of infinite cult indoctrination. The more educated you are, the better you are. Well, I graduated high school. Well, I took a first year in college. Well, I graduated college. Well, I got a postdoctoral degree of college. Well, I'm a professor. I got 2 postdoctoral degrees and went to college, and now I'm teaching college. Yeah, but you're teaching in this college. I'm teaching at Harvard. And I'm teaching in a more important subject, finance. So there's an endless line. But these endless lines lead to extremism. And if you were starting at the center of the possibility field and heading off in any direction without modulation, without balance, without counterpoint, you would eventually collapse your system with enough leverage getting out in extremes. If you're a car spoke, one of the things that goes from the hub out to hold the wheel. If you're a car spoke and you go out in this direction, you're supporting the tire. If you continue in this direction, you become the reason the car can't move. Because if there was a 3-foot, let alone a 3-mile piece of steel sticking out of this tire, you couldn't turn the wheel unless you snapped the steel. So what is healthy in moderation, in balance, and in relationship with other things becomes toxic in its extreme. And when we have a dualistic paradigm, courtesy of our cult, that says that this is good, like light is good, right? The light is good, right? And dark is bad, right? Well, try being in a room with 2 million watts of light. How about 20 million watts of light and no dark space? You can't protect your eyes. It'll go right through your hands. It'll start frying you alive. But we, for cult purposes, pretend that going in this direction is always good. Cleanliness is good. What about these people that have to frenetically wash their hands every 30 seconds or they have a panic attack? Is there any counterbalance? And cults are very bad at doing this counterbalance, but mathematics and geometry are very clear. You'd know exactly if you were making a spoke for a wheel. You'd know exactly if it was here, it wouldn't be good enough. Here, it wouldn't be good enough. Right when it connects solidly here, it's good enough, and then here it's too much. This is something that you can see with geometry and mathematics, and so it's a useful lens. So in consciousness and systems and specialization, low levels of consciousness start with simple systems, fewer words, fewer meanings, fewer awarenesses, and they move to higher distinctions, higher words, higher awarenesses, higher differentiations. Like an artist who's a master artist can tell more colors than you or I can. Their eye is trained to say, "Ooh, that's a cobalt blue, and that's a midnight blue, and that's an oil, and that's an acrylic, and that's a this," and they can tell that because they've trained in that distinction. So you move towards complexity, which leads towards a specialization and abundance, but also towards myopia. And then the question is, so you have an evolutionary development towards complexity, which leads to abundance and excellence. Because if you're just polishing Brazilian amethyst beads, and you do that for 10 years, you are going to polish this bead faster and more intelligently than someone who's never done it before, than someone who's only done it for 3 days. So specialization leads to efficiency, to productivity, to abundance. But it also leads to myopia, meaning you haven't traveled the world, you've been busy polishing amethyst, etc. So you have an evolutionary process towards complexity. The other evolutionary process you have over time, if you're designing structures and you keep doing asymmetrical structures and they keep falling over, you design a tree, for example, and you put all the branches of the tree on one side and you say, "Oh, doesn't it look cool and interesting? You've never seen a tree like that. Aren't I interesting?" And then it falls over in the next windstorm. You do it again and it falls over. You get tired of it, and so you design symmetrical trees. You design trees with branches in all directions. You realize, oh, now I don't have to keep replacing the tree and picking up the houses that it fell on. I can design symmetrically. So there's also an evolutionary process from asymmetrical dogmatic systems to scientifically symmetrical, balanced systems. That's another form of evolution. The next form of evolution is in this form of interrelationship. That the more relationships there are with the pieces, the more efficient the system and the more exponential is the possibility field of the system. When someone in Russia, where this mineral comes from, can network with someone in India who makes a necklace, can network with someone in Brazil who mines amethyst, and network with someone else who makes silver, and someone else that presses silver, and someone else that makes fishing twine, and someone else that makes little clasps, and someone else that ships all those things. Now you've got 10 different companies in a mix. And when they can all network together, this necklace goes from costing, millions of dollars to produce from scratch with all the technology, down to $100. So you have wealth generated in the partnering of efficiency. And so you can see that here, that the more connectivity between parts in a complex system, the more resilient the system becomes. This is a far more difficult sphere to crush than this one is. You can crush this one up here, you can crush it here, or you have to consume a lot of material to make it so that it doesn't crush. Because a designer, like a bicycle designer, a bicycle doesn't have to have spokes. It could have one spoke. A bicycle could have one spoke. It would just have to be huge, and it would have to be a very strong rim so that this one spoke coming out could hold the entire rim of a bicycle in place. Now, why aren't people doing that? Because it would have to be a very heavy rim, and then you'd have to pedal it. So you get an efficiency of deployment of energy if you have very delicate but infinitely complex threads of connection. That's when you get optimal resiliency. So you move towards complex, symmetrical, interconnected, and then reciprocal. Meaning, if you have a relationship with 1,000 people and you exploit and harm each one of those 1,000 people, if you exploit and harm each one of those 1,000 people, they eventually put up resistance to the energy flowing from you to them, because every time you send them energy, it's good for you and it hurts them. So they have to spend energy to resist the interaction so that they're not harmed by your reptilian behavior, your sociopathic behavior. All narcissists are reptilian. A narcissist has to reference the reptilian brain. The empathic regions of the brain care about other people. So to be narcissistic, you have to be reptilian. To be reptilian, it's not very much fun. Basically, all narcissists are untreated trauma patients. Trauma reduces people into fight, flight, and freeze, and then they're left there by a cult that doesn't have the decency or self-love for itself to help them get out of the sociopathic state that they've put them in. So then you're dealing with a lot of sociopaths, so now you have to put up a lot of defense. But defense is not intelligent. What's intelligent is trustworthy reciprocal connections. So the more you move from reptilian to rational partnership to empathic partnership, the less energy is spent in defense in these connections. And so you see that the evolutionary cycle of consciousness in humanity goes from simplistic thinking to complex thinking, from asymmetrical thinking to symmetrical thinking, from isolation to integration, and from integration through violence and trauma and violation to partnering and sustainable collaboration. That the most intelligent shape, that the most intelligent system in the universe is highly knowledgeable, meaning highly complex, highly symmetrical, meaning balanced, deeply interconnected, meaning well-resourced, and sustainable, meaning empathic and trustworthy. When you can achieve individuals, when your cult is intelligent enough to produce individuals that are highly conscious through language and knowledge and data in symmetrical areas, meaning emotional intelligence and mental intelligence, community building and efficiency. When you have symmetry in a way that is inclusive, because imagine what would happen with scapegoating in this geometric system. So in our cult, what we do is we scapegoat people. We have a dysfunctional cult that creates massive amounts of pain. And then rather than question the cult, we try and find someone who we can put the entire blame of the stupidity and limitation of the cult onto that one person. And then we try and kick them out. We don't invite them to the party, etc., etc. Well, what happens geometrically when you do that? You take this person, right? Poor, black, unclean shaven, whatever it is the cult nonsense comes up with. You say, let's get rid of him. We'll blame the whole cult stupidity on this one person. So you knock that connection, you knock that node out of this system. Well, that's all well and good, except next time this sphere hits a big rock, when you knock out the node, when you knock out that individual, this part can't link to it. This part can't link to it. This part all can't link to it. Now what that means is that the entire sphere is weaker by an exponential margin. It's not just weaker by one. Because you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in this system. When one gets knocked out to be scapegoated to protect the dogma of the cult, 8 get weaker. And it's 8 times 1. It's an exponential loss. And you also have to be pretty dumb to scapegoat. You take children with ADD, for example, right? And the teacher humiliates them in front of the class, right? Let's scapegoat this person who's exhibiting the symptoms of a dysfunctional system. Now, on the surface, as a good chauvinist, you can isolate the child and say, why are you fidgeting? Why can't you focus on me writing C spot run? And the kid, of course, has no idea. They're 8 years old. And so, well, you're going to be punished. Well, bravo, you've just humiliated a traumatized child. But you have to be pretty dumb not to understand that that child was not born with ADD. And so the real question is, what cultural design has to have gone on for that child to develop a traumatic coping mechanism of rapidly shifting their attention to avoid feeling what they're feeling in their body? Could it be beatings of mom at home? In our culture, sure. Could it be mom's an alcoholic? Absolutely. 1 in 8 Americans has a substance addiction. Could it be incest? 25% of Americans participate in sexual abuse in one time or another, in one way or another. Could it be beatings? A giant is going to beat them when they get home? You know, because if you're a 6 or an 8-year-old kid and your teacher is ignoring all your trauma that really matters because they're a moron, and everyone else is ignoring it as well, and instead what they're saying is, look, kid, you've got it all wrong. When you go home and are beaten, that doesn't matter. You see, what matters is that this person who doesn't particularly like you or care about you is talking about an imaginary dog running on a blackboard. See, spot, run. That's important. Screw your mother. Screw your traumatized biology. That doesn't matter. This matters. Imaginary dogs on blackboards. Now, if you've got half a brain at any point in your body, you know the system is wrong. You're fidgeting because you'll be punished if you say, this is a joke, could anyone help me avoid the next beating? Because everyone would freeze. What do we do? What do we do? The teacher would be in a panic, right? Because she doesn't want to talk about and get in a confrontation with an abusive parent. The principal doesn't want to look bad. And nobody knows what to do in an abuse cult that is incompetent. And so everyone will be all upset. And now the child will feel like, I've upset everyone. They've upset everyone by telling the truth in an incompetent system. The entire system is flawed. And they've done the one intelligent thing, tell the truth in that system, and suddenly they're being gossiped about, scapegoated. The parent hits them when they get home. What did you tell them about me? And hits them again, right? And the teacher's not going to follow the kid home. And the police, of course, have no idea how to handle this situation. And the foster parents who are getting paid to raise other people's children may or may not be any better. It's a fucked up system. And the kid knows it, and knows they'll be punished for talking about it, and knows that it's way more important than see, spot, run. So they're intelligently ramming back and forth within two lose-lose options with within a dysfunctional paradigm and a dysfunctional system. So scapegoating is not intelligent. If someone is demonstrating hyper-anxious things, there are things going on that are generating hyper-anxiety. And if those things are going up because anxiety and ADD is increasing in the population, a scientist studies the environment that produces those symptoms. It looks at the impact of electronic devices. It looks at the impacts on diet. It looks at the impact of violent media. It looks at the impact of pornography. It looks at all of the things that are changing and as part of that child's environment and creates a hypothesis. A hypothesis about what's going on in that child's body that's leading to this amount of trauma and what needs to happen in the cult to prevent it from happening and repair it when it happens and diagnose it when it happens. And what this does is it turns the symptom into the remedy. You study the node that is demonstrating the alarm. In other words, when the smoke detector goes off, you don't throw the smoke detector into the lake and said, I'm never going to have you be part of our family again. You look at the design of the smoke detector, you follow the smoke back to its source, and you put out the fire. So you follow this node back to every part of the system. You say, why is it that this kid is in this amount of trauma and their teacher doesn't know about it? And you learn that the teacher didn't study trauma. You say, okay, why doesn't the teacher study trauma? Given that we raise traumatized children, shouldn't they be able to understand traumatic symptoms? And you say that the education curriculum is chauvinistic and doesn't teach anything about feelings or biology. Well, why don't they have? Well, then because this is chauvinistic and this, and you follow the course and you find that, wow, chauvinism underlies every part of this system. The parents haven't studied to be parents. The police haven't studied to help mitigate childhood trauma. The neighbors haven't studied on how to support their neighbors in being better parents. The public hasn't studied detecting trauma symptoms as people walk by. The places where at the gas station don't hand out pamphlets for childhood abuse when they see someone being hit in the car. You realize that this is the only person who has nothing to do with it. It has to do with every other node in the system, and it's every other node in the system that has to change the way the system interacts with this node. That's intelligent design. See, geometry can reveal that in a way that doing what you've always done before and that everyone else around you is always doing will never reveal. Because in traumatic cultures, the unknown is always frightening. And so if you're asked to go blindly into the unknown in a traumatic culture, you're asked to go into fear with nowhere clear sense to go. And geometry can reveal some of these directions, some of this information more intelligently than any cult can. Because geometry is acultural. Science is acultural. Mathematics is acultural. So if you look at a sphere and say that keeping this node in the mix means that it's 8 units stronger than if it's deleted, and you want a strong sphere that's sustainable, you keep it in the mix. If science says that you study all the relationships and how they affect, then when a child presents traumatic symptoms, you study every grown-up around them and every system that interacted with all those grown-ups, and you learn about the entire world through the body of that child. Now that's intelligent. It's more intelligent than causing the disease. And that's why Einstein's comment that you cannot solve a problem with the same level of stupidity that you used to create it is so true. It doesn't take too much intelligence to instinctively say someone's going to get beaten here. I've no idea what I'm doing and nobody else does either. Nobody wants the blame put on them. I know, let's blame the 6-year-old. The 6-year-old has no advocate. Their abusive parents are not going to stand up for the child and say, yes, I abused them and that's why they have this and that and the other. That's not going to happen. So they're alone. Let's place it all on the 6-year-old. It's not very intelligent, but it's pretty easy. It's pretty instinctive. But you cannot heal and create grace. You cannot heal and create abundance and ease. You cannot, as a species, move from levels of chronic suffering to sustainable well-being with the level of intelligence that is used to scapegoat anyone in a dysfunctional cult. Every symptom of disease, whether on the violation or the victim side, whether on the masculine, the perpetrating, or the receiving side, the feminine, links back to an entire culture that raises victims and perpetrators because it's not intelligent enough to do otherwise. But the intelligent beginning is to look at every single part of the circle and take ownership. Because when every point in this circle owns the wheel, owns the circle, owns the synergy of creating a sustainable circle, that's what sustainability is. It can go on and on and on without collapsing. You've got a wheel with integrity. That's what sustainability is. And when every single person understands that they become more when in service to a sustainable whole, and that they own the system of which they are a part. They own the system. I serve the system and I get the benefits of synergy. I evolved the system because I've transcended the myopia and stupidity that says it's not my fault, it's not my problem. I'm going to figure this out. And that's a whole new level of intelligence that moves from the reptilian brain through the rational brain. This is all rationality. We're not talking empathy here. But when this is grasped intellectually and pivoted into behavior, a reality that is created through rationality, that is capable of giving birth through healing to the empathic brain that is too frozen in ice before the reality is caught up. Once that reality is realized through rationality and empathy is given birth to, empathy plus a high level of consciousness, meaning distinction, symmetry, mutuality, etc., leads to a level of abundance and grace that this planet has never known. Certainly this culture has never known. And you've reached a whole new level of intelligence, a geometric level of intelligence, an exponential, a synergistic level of intelligence, the kind of synergy you can only get when every point on the sphere collaborates with an awareness of being one with something bigger than the self, rather than separate from the whole of which we are a part. And thank you for joining me on this geometric exploration of reality.